Welcome back, AP Psychology students. This is part 2 of Module 29. Few different topics here. One, we'll talk a little bit about intrinsic and extrinsic motivation, which we've talked about earlier, and then the role of personal control and learning, which I think when we get into that, I think you'll really find it to be interesting. So the first slide here, we've talked about this. So just a quick refresher, understand that we have what are called intrinsic and extrinsic motivators. When you do something for intrinsic motivation, you're doing it for its own sake. You're doing it because you enjoy the task. You would do it even if you weren't getting money or you weren't getting tangible rewards, that kind of thing. So make sure you know the difference between intrinsic motivation and then extrinsic motivation is when you're being given, reward, money, grades, those kind of things. We talked about this earlier in the year, how also when you have intrinsic motivation, but then you're given extrinsic motivators, whether that's a reward or you're being able to avoid a punishment, kind of like a negative reinforcement kind of thing, that it actually reduces the intrinsic motivation. And that can have a negative impact on things like creativity and overall, performance. So bottom line, if you can find things both, in your day-to-day life and in your work life that you are not only extrinsically motivated to do, but also intrinsically motivated to do, you're going to be happier and more effective. The next part here, we're talking again about learning and personal control. So fascinating stuff. They've done a lot of research and they find that when people feel like they have control over their environment, they tend to perform better. Students perform better when they feel like they have some control over their environment. Employees do better work when they're given some control over their environment. It always makes me think of, I think it's Google. They have is it 1 hour a day where they, what do they call it? Like a genius hour or something, where they give everybody 1 hour a day that they get to do whatever they want with it. Just, you're working on your task, just show us what you did. And they found that it really boosted productivity. So think about how we could, do this in schools. I think we need to be giving students more control over their day. And students would do better because they would, they'd have some intrinsic motivation and they'd feel a sense of control. But again, not having control, it can hurt your health. They find that people that don't have control, people that live in poverty and don't feel like they have control over their lives, they have higher rates of illness, heart disease, those kind of things. So we ought to be trying to find ways to give people control over their lives. That being said, some terms that kind of go with this, we're looking at the slide here about coping strategies. How do we cope when we have stress? It's a stressful time for everybody. Two different types here, problem-focused coping and emotion-focused coping. So problem-focused coping is when you try to deal with the problem, the task at hand. So if you are, stressed out by school or stressed out by work, let's meet it head on. Okay, let's make a to-do list. Let's make a pros and cons list. Let's actually get into the details of what's bothering me, and let's figure out a solution to fix the issue. You're behind in a class. Let's talk to the teacher. Let's make a list. Let's start checking things off. Let's make a plan. What are we going to do? Emotion-focused coping is when you feel stressed out by things. You do things to work on your emotions just to make you feel better, in the moment. So this would, include things like, I'm going to call up my friend and say, oh my gosh, can you believe Mr. Dowell? This class is oh my gosh, it's unfair. I can't believe he's given us all this work. And you just basically have, you just complain, things like that. Or you say, you know what, I'm tired, I'm stressed. I'm giving myself the night off. I've earned it. I'm going to go watch Netflix. I'm going to go have a bowl of ice cream. I'm going to go do whatever. You do things to attend to your emotional needs. So where does control come in? We tend to find people used more problem-focused coping when they feel like they have some control over the outcome. Oftentimes, people resort to emotion-focused coping when they don't feel or they feel little control. It's like, hey, this is happening. I don't really know how to handle it. So I'm overwhelmed. So instead of trying to tackle the problem, I'm just gonna, have a bowl of ice cream and watch Netflix and just avoid it. Obviously, we know that that doesn't help. That makes it worse. So I do want to say, though, that there are times where emotion-focused coping is beneficial. There are times in your life where you don't have control. I'm sure we can all think of a lot of those examples right now. So when you legit don't have any control, it's okay to say, you know what? Forget today. I'm just taking the night off. I'm gonna just do whatever makes me feel good and whatever. The key is to learn to differentiate. If you're falling behind in a class, let's control what we can control. Let's use some problem-focused coping. Let's attack the problem. Let's not just put it off, and let's all wait till next week, and let's get after it. But again, there are times where emotion-focused coping is okay, but more of the time you would want to be using problem-focused coping. Learned helplessness. So this is the tendency to give up any effort to control our environment. So what happens basically is you try something, you fail. You try something, you fail. You try something, you fail. And you learn to be helpless. You learn, like, my effort doesn't matter here, so I'm just going to give up. And the original research on this is actually kind of sad. They brought these dogs into a lab, and they would put them in this room, and part of the room, the floor was electrified, so it would send random shocks to these dogs, poor pups. And so what they found is these dogs were getting shocked, and there was nothing they could do to avoid the shock. And then they opened up the room, and they had part of the room that was electrified and another part of the room that wasn't. And they found that after the dogs had learned that there was nothing they could do earlier, they quit even trying to get away from the electrified portion of the floor. Even though they could get away from it, they didn't even bother to try because they had learned that their effort didn't matter. So again, they gave up any effort to control their environment. There's a decrease in responding. So at first, the dogs were jumping around like, "Oh my gosh, let me get me out of here." But after a while, they just sat there and took the shocks because they didn't know they could do anything different. So you think about, again, if a young person is struggling in a class, and they might they try, they fail, they try, they fail. They might get to a point where they just say, you know what? I can't do this. And that may not be correct, but they would perceive that about themselves, that I've tried, I failed numerous times, I don't think that I can do this, so I just give up. So you can see the connection, things like depression, things like anxiety, poor performance in school or at work. If you've convinced yourself that you can't do it, that would be learned helplessness. And then we have a couple of terms. I mean, these terms are all kind of related. In people with an internal locus of control, it's the perception that you control your own fate. It's the belief that, maybe I struggled in the past, but I can change, my future. I can turn it around. The key here is that it's a perception or a belief, because there are times where, again, you have no control. But it's a belief that overall, I can control what I'm doing. I can control whether I'm successful or I fail. And then people with an external locus of control, so external, it's outside of you, it's this belief or perception that outside forces or luck control your fate. So again, I keep going back to this example of a student in a class. If you have an internal locus of control, you would say, okay, whether I do well or not on the next AP psychology test is up to me. It's, I'm going to be the one that's going to go study. I'm going to do this. I'm going to do this. I control it. Someone with an external locus of control might say, oh man, hope Dowell gives us some easy questions because that's going to determine whether I do well or not. You don't seem to think that it's up to you to be successful or what's going to control your fate. It's something outside of you. There's some recent research that is showing that some people in your generation tend to have more of an external locus of control than earlier generations. That's one study, so don't take it to the bank. But it kind of makes me wonder what, if that's true, what could be causing it. I mean, there's a lot of things you could maybe pin it on, but you definitely know the difference between those two. Research shows that generally people with an internal locus of control are, they're generally more well-adjusted. They're generally more successful because they take ownership for whether they're successful. They don't think it's just up to fate. If you think about learned helplessness, which we just talked about, learned helplessness oftentimes would lead to an external locus of control. If you tried, you fail, you try, you fail, you realize, well, it doesn't matter anyway. So you could develop an external locus of control from that. And then finally, talking a little bit about self-control, the ability to control impulses and delay gratification. Some interesting research on this. Some studies have found that the ability to do this, it can fluctuate throughout the day. And some research has concluded that we have a finite amount of this. Basically, we have like a certain amount of willpower during the day, and once it's used up, it's gone. So this makes me think of like, as someone who, I eat more junk food than I probably should, and I think about, when do I eat the junk food? It's usually at the end of the day. And I think to myself, well, it took willpower to get out of bed. It took willpower to come to work. It took willpower to not yell at my kids at some point and when they were misbehaving. And at the end of the day, it's like, you know what? It's gone. I have no more willpower. I have no more, craps to give. I give in for the day. So think about someone who's having a hard time. If they have a job where they have to be really nice to people, like fake nice to people, and at some point you only have so much of that. Think about like people who work with the public and retail, and they get yelled at for stupid stuff, and you could run out of it at some point. Again, there are some studies that kind of go against this, but it's interesting to think about. And if you look in the book, they talk about there are some ways that you can strengthen self-control. Things like eating habits, not smoking, getting yourself to study. That's something we can all use right now. I know that being able to come to school and sit on a Zoom for a big chunk of the day when there's no one in the house telling you like, hey, do this, do this. I mean, that's got to take a lot of self-control. And I think, some are doing better than others. So, but you can look at the end of Module 29. They kind of talk about a few things that you can do to help strengthen it. But the bottom line is that you can, with practice, your brain is like a muscle here. If you can practice doing these things over time, a habit forms, and these behaviors can continue. So interesting section, lots of, hopefully you can make some connections to this and think, oh yeah, maybe I have an internal locus of control here, but external here. And, maybe you can think of a time you've had learned helplessness or have seen that in other people. So that's a good place to stop. We'll finish there, and we'll talk to you soon. Thanks, guys.